The night the FBI walked into Ed Sullivan's studio, everything stopped. Not the cameras, not the orchestra. Ed Sullivan. For the first time in his career, the man who never flinched on live television froze in place. Because minutes later, the President of the United States was on the line. At first, no one understood why federal agents were standing under the stage lights. They weren't there for a celebrity. They weren't there for Ed. They were carrying a message that was never meant to be heard in a theater full of families. A message that could end the show or save a life. And in that moment, before the truth came out, Ed faced a choice no host is trained for. A choice that would test whether a man built on composure could risk everything for compassion. On a cold Sunday evening in early 1964, CBS Studio 50 felt like the safest, most predictable place in American entertainment. The crew moved with practiced rhythm. The audience filed in with the same quiet excitement they had carried for years. And at the center of it all was Ed Sullivan, standing just off stage with a night's running order held neatly in his hand. He didn't fidget. He didn't pace. He never had to. For more than 15 years, Ed had led America through the surprise guests, the broken microphones, the nervous teenagers making their first national appearance. Nothing startled him. Nothing bent his calm. It was 10 minutes before airtime, and everything looked exactly as it should. The orchestra tuned their last notes. A Broadway cast rehearsed their final steps in the corner. Stagehands hurried to tape down a cable that had slid too close to the performance space. The young comedian booked for the second act kept whispering her lines under her breath, just loud enough for a stage manager to hear every word and nod with approval. It was a night Ed expected to run with perfect precision. There were moments during rehearsal when a few people thought they noticed something unusual. Two unfamiliar men standing near the studio doors, quietly scanning the crowd of performers and staff. But in a building that hosted celebrities, diplomats, and sometimes entire film crews, unfamiliar faces were nothing new. No one imagined they were watching the first signs of a night that would break the rules of live television. Inside the control room, the technical director reviewed the camera plan. Everything mapped cleanly. 3 wide shots, 2 close-ups, and the standard sweep across the audience that gave the show its warm, communal feel. Nothing in the room suggested danger or urgency. If anything, the atmosphere felt almost peaceful. Even the jokes from the lighting crew, usually loud and mischievous, were softer that night, as if settling into the same quiet confidence that surrounded the studio. Ed Sullivan looked over the list one more time, checking the placement of the young pianist who was scheduled to make her American television debut. She was a last-minute addition. Her name had barely appeared in newspapers, but Ed liked unknown talent. He liked giving someone a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. What he didn't know, what no one in the room knew, was how quickly that moment would vanish, and how swiftly his night of routine would turn into one of the most unforgettable broadcasts he ever faced. The clock on the studio wall struck 9 minutes to air when the first disturbance broke the calm. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was the sound of a heavy studio door opening, followed by the unmistakable hush that spread whenever something serious entered a room built for entertainment. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside with a purpose that cut through every conversation. They moved without hesitation, as if they had walked these corridors 100 times, even though not a single person on staff recognized them. A stagehand near the door later recalled how the air changed the second they walked in. Studio 50 had hosted presidents, kings, and rock and roll storms of screaming teenagers. But federal agents arriving moments before a live broadcast was not part of any routine. Their badges came out quickly, almost respectfully, as if they understood the weight of crossing into this world of bright lights and polished timing. The men asked for Ed Sullivan by name. He was standing only a few feet away, discussing camera angles with a director. When he turned and saw those badges, he didn't blink, but something behind his eyes tightened. A small, almost invisible crack in the armor of a man known for never losing control. He stepped aside with the agents while the rest of the room pretended not to stare. They handed him a sealed envelope stamped with a federal crest. One of them spoke quietly, leaning in so that no one else could hear. Those close by noticed Ed's shoulders stiffen as he opened the envelope and began to read. The words inside were short, direct, and carried more danger than anything he had ever faced on live television. The FBI had intercepted a letter addressed to the network earlier that day. It threatened violence if a particular performer appeared on that night's show, a young pianist from Eastern Europe scheduled for the third act. The language in the letter was filled with Cold War paranoia, the kind that had seeped into American life since the early 1950s and never fully left. But this was more than fear-mongering. The message contained references that the Bureau considered specific and credible. Ed tried to maintain his usual calm. He asked the agents if additional security could resolve the issue. They explained why it couldn't. The threat wasn't vague. It wasn't one of those letters broadcasters occasionally received from overzealous critics. This was different. And then, as if the moment needed one final turn, a second message arrived from the control room. The White House operator was trying to reach him urgently. The night had changed. The show had changed. And Ed Sullivan knew for the first time in his career that stepping on stage as planned might not be the right thing to do. The message from the White House added a new weight to the already tense studio. It arrived through the control room, carried by a stunned technician who had never heard the presidential switchboard ask for Ed Sullivan by name. The timing alone was impossible to ignore. Ed took a slow breath before following the FBI agents to a quiet corner near the orchestra pit, where a phone had been set down on a folding table. Every step he took seemed to pull the crew deeper into silence. The call was brief. President Lyndon B. Johnson did not waste time on formalities. He had been informed of the threat and understood the sensitivity of the situation. His voice, steady and unmistakable, carried both authority and a surprising softness. He told Ed that if the Bureau believed the danger was real, then Ed should decide what was safest. "You know your stage," Johnson said. "Do what you think is right for the girl." It wasn't an order. It was something far heavier. Responsibility placed in the hands of a man trained to control a show, not protect a life. After the call ended, Ed remained standing there for a moment, one hand on the edge of the table, eyes lowered. Those who passed by later remembered how still he was. It was the look of someone trying to hold together two very different worlds. The world of timing, entertainment, and comforting routine, and the world of threats, fear, and the fragile hope carried by one young performer backstage. The girl in question was 21 years old, a pianist from Budapest who had fled Hungary with her mother after the Soviet invasion of 1956. They had spent years rebuilding their lives, moving from city to city, carrying their only surviving possessions in a single worn suitcase. Tonight was meant to be her moment of joy, her first American television appearance, the break every immigrant musician prayed for. She had rehearsed quietly for hours, fingers gliding over the keys of a small practice piano, as if whispering to the instrument the way some people speak to old friends. When Ed approached her dressing room, he could hear her playing through the door, soft, careful notes drifting into the hallway. Her mother sat beside her, hands folded tightly in her lap. Neither of them had any idea that federal agents were debating whether she should perform at all. Neither knew that the president himself had weighed in. And as Ed stood there, reaching for the doorknob, he understood that what he said next might change the course of her life. When Ed Sullivan opened the dressing room door, the music stopped. The young pianist lifted her hands from the keys and rose to her feet, the way someone might when a respected elder enters a quiet room. Her mother stood as well, smoothing the front of her simple dress with trembling fingers. They were guests here. More than that, they were grateful guests. Neither woman could imagine that danger had followed them into the one place they believed was safe. Ed stepped inside with a heaviness that did not belong to him. For more than a decade, he had introduced legends without ever revealing a hint of nerves. But now his voice wavered. He explained gently that the FBI had found a threat. He avoided harsh words, avoided anything that could frighten her. Still, the meaning settled over the room like a shadow. The pianist listened quietly. She didn't look frightened. She looked thoughtful, almost calm, as if she'd spent her whole life preparing for moments when the world turned unpredictable. Then, with a steady voice, she said something the stage manager nearest the door never forgot. "Mr. Sullivan, I've played through war before." Ed felt the sentence hit him somewhere deeper than he expected. She had fled tanks as a child. She had practiced scales during nights when explosions shook the windows of Budapest. She had lived an entire childhood where music was the only thing that didn't break. And now, in the heart of New York City, a place that had promised safety, she was being told she might be in danger again. Her mother clutched a handkerchief, silent tears running down her face. She whispered, "We came here for peace." Her voice cracked on the last word, the kind of sound that makes even strangers feel protective. That was the moment Ed Sullivan changed. The man who handled disasters, egos, and last-second cancellations without blinking suddenly lowered his head. For the first time in his professional life, he needed a moment to gather himself. Crew members watching from the hall later said they saw him bring both hands to his face, standing utterly still. It was not weakness. It was grief. Grief that this young woman's dream had been interrupted by a threat she did not deserve. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "You will not be put in danger for the sake of television." There was no debate after that. The show was rewritten. Her segment was removed. Security escorted her and her mother through a private exit while performers bowed their heads in quiet respect. A decision had been made, and it was not for ratings or reputation or routine. It was for humanity. When the broadcast finally began that night, the cameras revealed a host forever changed. Ed Sullivan stepped into the familiar glow of the stage lights, but something in his posture was different. The audience at home may not have noticed it right away, but those inside Studio 50 felt it instantly. A heaviness in his voice, a gravity usually reserved for national tragedies, not variety shows. He made a brief statement about adjustments to tonight's program and moved on without explanation. That was all he allowed himself to say. The rest of the truth stayed behind the curtain, protected from the noise of headlines. The show continued, but those on stage sensed the quiet hum beneath it all. Performers spoke in softer tones, as if aware that they were stepping across sacred ground. Between acts, crew members whispered updates about the pianist and her mother, relieved to know they had left the building safely. A few musicians passed around a hat backstage, contributing small bills and coins to support her upcoming concert tour. A gesture of kindness that spread from hand to hand without a single word spoken aloud. In the days that followed, hardly anyone outside the studio learned what had happened. Newspapers mentioned unplanned program changes, but the real story remained sealed inside FBI files and remembered only in private conversations among those who had witnessed Ed's transformation. Live television was built on protecting the illusion of control. Revealing how close they had come to danger would have shattered that illusion instantly, yet the moment did not disappear. It lived quietly in the memories of the people who worked there. Camera operators, makeup artists, musicians who went home that night with a deeper understanding of the man they saw every Sunday. One stagehand later said, "It was the first time I realized Ed wasn't just the host. He was the guardian of the room." Years passed. The pianist built a modest but meaningful career. She taught children, performed in small halls, and kept a photograph of her mother on the piano wherever she traveled. In a 1987 interview, she spoke about her short encounter with Ed Sullivan. She said she remembered his eyes, kind but tired, as if he had carried something heavy that night. For Ed, the memory never left him. Later in life, he told a colleague, "Sometimes the real show happens where no one can see." It was his way of acknowledging that the golden age of television wasn't defined only by applause or famous moments on camera. It was built on the quiet decisions that revealed who people truly were. And on that night in 1964, when the FBI walked into his studio and the president waited on the line. Ed Sullivan proved something that outlasted any performance, that choosing humanity, even in the glare of the brightest lights, is the moment history remembers.